Usually we deal with the analysis of life, military of different historical eras, legionary crusaders and Spartans. Interesting but peaceful life no less, exciting and sometimes more devastating for sure. Everyone saw creepy plague doctor costumes, glass eyes, beaks, long cloaks. The image of the guys is closely associated with something gloomy and harsh, but who are they on? In fact, today we will live one day from the life of a plague doctor and understand what's on. They are really cute and did a very good job. Meet our guest Harry Kane, yard in 1650, and he lives in a beautiful city of Edinburgh. Profession Harry Plague Doctor. He lives on the outskirts of the city in a very rich house in which is full of expensive trinkets. In a local bar they pour quinu for free, and even the church, in spite of the defiant appearance, is in no hurry to lug Harry on fire, at least for a second. In the yard 17th century it was still commonplace. The reason is simple: the whole continent is raging a plague. A profession Kane deal with this problem, and before we move on, we will report the situation in more detail. Plague is a terrible disease with almost 95% mortality at first. A person feels pain and inflammation in lymph nodes, then the nodes increase and patient begins to have a fever. Interval from 2 to 12 days. Infected may also face the plague, pneumonia, and with a huge proportion probability dies. Inflamed lymph nodes look specific and similar. The tumor is called a bubo, precisely on this basis. In various medieval sources, what most often called bubonic, as you are sure know the surest way to get infected. Plague is a rat bite, but there is another one, much more deadly vector. Fleas. They are small, they jump and bite people. And what is the worst they endure? How the plague is carried by people, can be infected by contact with human and airborne. In our time, the mildest plague is treated antibiotics, streptomycin or its analogues, but the first vaccine was tested only in 1934, so our ancestors had to hard. Contrary to the stereotype, the plague is far from medieval disease mentioned. They are still in the Bible. In the chapter describing the war of Israel, and the hand of the Lord was heavy on the Philistines, as at Yanami, and he hit them and punished them. Painful growths in nitrogen and in, the Bible says so around it, which itself attributed deadly effect of the plague of God square. But as can be understood from the description of growths, these are most likely buboes, but judging by terrible mortality among people, speech almost 100% is about the plague. A little later in our century, mass cases, diseases became known as pandemics. Only one pandemic is called Justiniana Vi, started in 550, the first year in 30 years, bringing more than 100 million lives to that moment, is almost a third of the population. Civilized world since, at various intervals, the plague returned, taking the terrible harvest of 1350. The second year, another pandemic took 25 million Europeans, a third of the population of the continent. The disease is not. Harry was vacationing in Edinburgh in 1650. Infected people slowly made their way to Russia. That epidemic of 1654-55 claimed 700,000 lives. Moscow was devastated. Half someone died and someone fled from the disease, thereby spreading it into entire regions. Died out from the epidemic. Cities like Glukov and Belozero. Almost throughout the history of mankind, the plague has been with people side by side, even after the invention vaccines in India between the start of the 20th century and until 1963 died from the disease more than 12 million people, but very advanced in terms of medicine of the USSR. Throughout the existence of the state, the plague took 2,000 lives. It's simple: in the USSR there were plague doctors. Their work is strictly classified lods, and a whole network was created. Institutions that dealt with plague monitoring, checking rats, block out potentially dangerous countries, network lives, and to this day, and thanks to the USSR, in the CIS community does not suffer from the plague. But in Edinburgh 1650, our poor Harry Kane could not boast of such rich heritage of Greek and Roman medicine, successfully divided by 0 cr, and considered it not a charitable deed. Sick people in the first place called priests, thinking doctors are eccentrics, hence the wild mortality figures that eventually led to the appearance of the plague. Doctors like Harry prayers didn't help, and no matter how people loved the church became obviously something needs to be done, and against the background of hundreds of thousands of corpses, medicine somehow got off the ground. Although the shift cannot be called cardinal, treated by and large by poking, someone cauterized the wounds, someone was engaged, bloodletting, especially smart, smeared with. We'll talk about the details with leeches later. But while we move on to the Harry costume, characteristic cloak and mask of the plague pector of was not worn by all representatives professions. They were generally invented in 1619. The efforts of the French physician Charles de Lomo, he created the very equipment, and centuries before, doctors wore what? Horrible are Harry the good plague doctor, so dressed appropriate on the head. Kana flaunts a helmet, in fact being prototype of a gas mask. He is completely covers his head and even his eyes, protecting them. Glass eyepieces the same nibble, giving a zest to the costume. Actually carries payload first in the beak, through strong-smelling herbs and other doctors' medicines. I worked out not particularly pleasant-smelling patients, but sometimes even with corpses where required. Corny not to faint from the smell. Also part of the beak in contact with covered her nose with a sponge with incense, and the doctor constantly chewed garlic, further and rest against the cloak and the mane, whose idea is to protect the doctor's body. Harry, like all his representatives, profession, did not want to touch. Gloves helped patients, long fishing boots and cane and examined patients, cauterized wounds and, if necessary, fended off particularly violent was the suit. Plague doctors effective? Partly yes. After all, as we mentioned, the plague is indeed passed on contact so close. The body is quite intelligent. Besides this, Harry lubricates clothes with grease and wax, by itself ingeniously the main carrier. Flee diseases, and through such clothes they can't bite. But garlic is absolutely superfluous, and not like the plague does not save like beak, because we mentioned that pneumonic plague easily transmitted through the air. Therefore, mortality among the dark, but still it was big what it consists of. Day of the Plague Doctor. Let's start with the fact that there are varieties immediately. A few of the first can be called scavengers, one of the most frequent orders that our Harry receives. This is the removal and burial of corpses and religion, and right deeply believing nobles, forgotten and often local lords from Edinburgh called doctors to get and the dead were taken away and dumped somewhere in Channel, and along the way, Harry could pick up from their homes anything. Greed was weaker, survival instinct, and in the homes of the dead, few dared to enter in the end. Plague doctors, in addition to the removal of corpses, they could have everything they wanted. So at the beginning we mentioned a nice house and a bunch of old knickknacks. K for the removal of corpses is only part of it. Work, but there were doctors who did. That's just what we'll call her scavengers, and move on to another categories. The second category of doctors, of which and our Harry refers to the orderlies. These guys really tried help, but found themselves in a harsh framework. Reality where medicine has not been for 500 years. Developed similar doctors were engaged in removal of corpses, but along the way tried receive the most patients. Common method of autopsy treatment: inflamed lymph node, scalpel, and its subsequent cauterization. The trouble is that there are a lot of inflamed nodes. The operation is very painful, and besides, it is not enough to burn millimeter plague infected surfaces, and the result will come to naught. However, in a career, Harry Kane had a successful case. Treatments, though they also crashed about. The harsh reality was that if the man was cured, then God helped him. But if someone died, then guilty fielded a doctor. Of course, the death rate exceeded the number of cured, and therefore our Harry lives on the outskirts and is considered an outcast. Really free booze out of respect for professions. They still pour him something in his turn can result in a drunken fight with one of the disgruntled relatives. Deceased. What to talk about if, until the 19th century, astrology was considered real science and much more prestigious than medicine. In addition, some of the category orderlies resorted to extravagant method of treatment. Someone fed the sick spiders, believing that they absorb the bad. Someone forced to sniff horse droppings to kill. Why? Especially smartbanks put the stink. Applied frogs and treated with leeches. But the third and smallest category of plague doctors are visionaries. These guys were very educated people who tried to apply their genius to solve the problem too. Example: the famous doctor was a famous, and Nostradamus' prediction were his hobby. But in fact, Michel is before us born highly gifted doctor for his contributions to plague fighting. Parliament, one of regions of France, even issued Nostradamus a lifetime pension. There were other guys like a DSHK surgeon, discovering what a guy isolated from society and for a whole week systematically cut and squeezed plague growths. Later we cauterized them. It worked. And Dosherac tried to apply knowledge in wide practice. Worked. Unfortunately, not very. Murder of Roman heritage and the cult of the church is not the only reason for the world was dominated by total unsanitary conditions where not bathing for a couple of months was common, in part, and the dirt is, like everyone is aware, of the block's best friend. Plague doctors were one of the straws to which the mighty of this world clung to save their asses, even though they are not especially loved, but any city guys were needed. Therefore, our Harry Kane also sat on a contract with the local mayor. The guy's monthly salary was outstanding £110 for a second. It is 6.5 tons of beef, or 220 kilogram for everyday ordinary carpenter. Earned Harry's monthly salary for 2 years. For comparison, a whole year of rent. Luxury apartment on the central streets. Cities cost about £50 of money even among the lower caste. Plague doctors had no problems, and it was only to survive. Science still cannot answer the question why. Unsanitary conditions and zero medicine. The plague did not kill the entire planet. Fuck the most popular version. Development of immunity. Similar to vaccines naturally. Maybe some people really caught a weakened one and rebuilt. Organs. Maybe the plague has a limit. Breeding, but possibly plague doctors still invested their might recycling corpses and maintaining at least some visibility sanitation. So our old man, Harry Kane, did good albeit dirty, dealing with a huge risk to life, perhaps due to his treatment. Some of our ancestors survived. Please like this video, because that's all. We'll see you soon, friends.